At precisely 6:47 a.m. on August 29, 1944, a single GMC truck emblazoned with a painted red ball rumbled out of the port of Cherbourg in northwestern France. Behind it, stretching back toward the horizon, 5,957 more trucks followed. The convoy was so massive that if you stood at one end, you could not see where it ended. Each truck carried 12,500 pounds of supplies. Together, they would transport 12,000 tons of ammunition, gasoline, rations, and medical equipment in a single day. This was the Red Ball Express at its operational peak, the largest truck convoy system ever attempted in military history. And 75% of the men who drove those trucks were African American soldiers, whom the United States Army had deemed unfit for combat. 3 months earlier, the situation had been entirely different. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history, deployed more than 1 million soldiers into France by mid-July. But those soldiers remained confined to a lodgment only 50 miles wide and 20 miles deep, roughly half the size of Long Island. They were trapped in the labyrinth of Norman hedgerows, fighting a brutal war of attrition against German defenders who knew every stone wall and sunken road. The campaign threatened to become a second Western Front, a bloody stalemate that could drag on for years. Then, on July 25, 1944, everything changed. Operation Cobra commenced with a massive aerial bombardment near the town of St. Lo. Lieutenant General Omar Nelson Bradley's First Army ruptured the German defensive line. 3 armored divisions poured through the gap. The very next day, Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr. took command of the newly activated Third Army and unleashed his armor across the open fields of central France. By August the 13th, American spearheads had reached Le Mans, 90 miles from Paris. By August 25th, the French capital was liberated. The Allies had finally achieved what they had been fighting for since June, a breakout. But Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight David Eisenhower now faced a problem that no amount of tactical brilliance could solve. His armies were advancing at speeds of up to 75 miles per day. Every mile they traveled doubled the difficulty of keeping them supplied. Each of the 28 Allied divisions in the field required approximately 750 tons of supplies per day just to maintain offensive operations. That totaled 21,000 tons daily. Patton's Third Army alone consumed 800,000 gallons of gasoline in a single 24-hour period. And there was no railway system to deliver any of it. The irony was devastating. In the months before D-Day, Eisenhower had made an unpopular but strategically sound decision. He had ordered Allied bombers to systematically destroy the French railway network. Every bridge, every marshalling yard, every steam engine within range of Normandy had been targeted. The goal was to prevent Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, from quickly moving his panzer divisions to counterattack the invasion beaches. The bombing campaign succeeded brilliantly. The Germans could not reinforce Normandy. But now the Allies could not use the railways either. The tracks they had destroyed to win the battle were the same tracks they needed to win the war. By late August 1944, the supply crisis had become catastrophic. The deep-water ports of Le Havre and Antwerp remained in German hands. Cherbourg on the Cotentin Peninsula was operational, but it was designed for commercial shipping, not military logistics. The temporary Mulberry harbors constructed on the invasion beaches had unloaded 170,000 vehicles, 7.5 million gallons of fuel, and 500,000 tons of supplies by the end of June. But the beaches were 200 miles behind the front line now. Every gallon of gasoline, every artillery shell, every bandage and ration had to be trucked overland on narrow French country roads that had never been designed for military convoys. Patton's tanks were running dry. Without fuel, the Allied advance would grind to a halt. The Germans would have time to regroup. The war that might have ended in 1944 would drag into 1945 or beyond. On August 23, 1944, Allied commanders met for an emergency planning session at Communications Zone Headquarters, commonly known as COMZ. The meeting lasted 36 hours. The principal planners were Lieutenant Colonel Loren Albert Ayers, Chief of the Motor Transport Brigade, and Major Gordon Kenneth Gravel from COMZ staff. Ayers was known to his men as Little Patton for his aggressive temperament and his absolute refusal to accept failure. His task was to devise a system that could move 82,000 tons of supplies between August 25th and September 2nd. That was just over 1 week. It was impossible by any conventional standard. Ayers and Gravel conceived of a radical solution. They would pool every available truck asset from COMZ and the Motor Transport Brigade into a single unified operation. They would create 2 dedicated one-way highways running in a massive loop from the supply depots in Normandy to the forward logistics bases near the front. Civilian traffic would be banned entirely. Military police would control every intersection to ensure that convoys never had to stop. The trucks would be marked with the red ball insignia. The roads would be marked with the same red balls. The system would operate continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with drivers working in 2-man teams so that one could sleep while the other drove. The name came from a railway tradition dating back to the 1890s. Railroad companies had marked priority freight cars with a large red dot to indicate express service. Those trains were given clearance on every track. Every other train had to pull aside and let them pass. Ayers and Gravel borrowed the name and the concept. They called it the Red Ball Express. On Friday, August 25, 1944, at 6 a.m., the Red Ball Express began operations. 3,558 trucks from 67 truck companies rolled out of St. Lo, carrying 4,482 tons of supplies. The trucks were primarily GMC CCKW 2.5-ton cargo vehicles, nicknamed Jimmies, though the convoy also included Dodge 1.5-ton trucks and support jeeps. The route ran 125 miles eastward to the Chartres-Dreux area, where forward supply depots had been established. The northern route was reserved for loaded trucks heading toward the front. The southern route was reserved for empty trucks returning to Normandy. Both roads were closed to all civilian vehicles. By August 29th, just 4 days after launch, the system had expanded dramatically. 132 truck companies were now operating 5,958 vehicles. They transported over 12,000 tons of supplies in a single day. It was the highest tonnage the Red Ball Express would ever achieve. But there was a critical shortage. The Red Ball required drivers, 23,000 of them. Ayers needed 2 drivers for every truck so that convoys could operate continuously without rest stops. The problem was that the Army did not have 23,000 trained truck drivers sitting idle in France. Most soldiers had been assigned to combat units or specialized roles. Ayers needed bodies, and he needed them immediately. He found them in the segregated support units of the United States Army. In 1944, the American military operated under a strict system of racial segregation. African American soldiers were prohibited from serving in most combat roles. Military leadership at the highest levels believed that black soldiers lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage necessary for frontline service. This belief persisted despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and despite the fact that African Americans had served with distinction in every American conflict since the Revolutionary War. As a result, approximately 75% of the 900,000 black soldiers in the Army were relegated to service and support positions. They worked in mess halls, laundries, construction battalions, and motor pools. They loaded ships. They built roads. They performed the unglamorous but essential labor that kept the war machine functioning. Lieutenant Colonel Ayers requisitioned soldiers from units across the European theater whose duties were not considered combat critical. Most of the men he found were under the age of 24. Most were African American. Most had never driven a truck before the war. They were given abbreviated training, issued uniforms, and assigned to newly formed quartermaster truck companies. 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were black. They would become the backbone of the most successful logistics operation in military history. The drivers worked under conditions that would have been considered intolerable by any peacetime standard. The official plan called for trucks to travel at 25 miles per hour, maintaining 60-yard intervals between vehicles, moving in convoys of no fewer than 5 trucks, escorted by jeeps at the front and rear. In reality, these rules were almost immediately abandoned. Trucks left Cherbourg as soon as they were loaded, often traveling alone. Drivers disabled the engine governors installed by the manufacturers to prevent speeds above 56 miles per hour. On open roads, Red Ball trucks regularly exceeded 60 miles per hour. They drove through rain, mud, and darkness. They navigated by tiny blackout lights called cat eyes, dim bulbs designed only for vehicle identification, not illumination. Later, when the need for supplies became even more desperate, COMZ authorized the use of headlights in areas at least 10 miles from the front lines. The round trip from Cherbourg to the forward depots and back took 54 hours. Drivers worked in 2-man teams, alternating at the wheel. Sleep was taken in the cab, in 15 or 20-minute intervals, while the truck bounced over rutted roads at high speed. First Sergeant Levada Hall of Cleveland, Ohio, served with the 30,715th Quartermaster Truck Company. Decades later, his grandson Benjamin Hall recounted stories his grandfather had told him. On more than one occasion, commanding officers sent black drivers into areas suspected of containing enemy soldiers, using them essentially as scouts to test whether German forces remained in the region. The lives of black soldiers, Sergeant Hall explained, were not considered as important as those of white soldiers. The roads were littered with debris from the fighting. Sea ration cans, shrapnel, barbed wire, and unexploded ordnance lay scattered across the pavement. Tires blew out constantly. Over 40,000 truck tires were worn out during the 83 days the Red Ball Express operated. Trucks tipped over when supplies were stacked too high. Transmissions burned out in the mud. The French roads had been designed for farm carts and civilian automobiles, not for endless convoys of heavy military trucks. The pavement cracked. The shoulders collapsed. The roots became rivers of mud when it rained. The trucks used 11-inch wheels that could be easily overwhelmed by soft ground. Efforts to escape mud often resulted in stripped gears and immobilized brakes as dried mud caked onto the mechanical systems. Mechanical failure was not the only danger. German prisoners of war were sometimes used to assist with vehicle maintenance at supply depots. They checked tire pressure, cleaned windshields, and checked oil levels. Some were caught deliberately sabotaging trucks by putting water into gasoline cans. Landmines remained buried along roadsides. Accidents caused by fatigue, inexperience, and overloading killed and injured scores of drivers. Most vehicles brought in for repair, approximately 1,500 daily, were the result of single-vehicle wrecks. Sleep deprivation caused breakdowns in morale and discipline. Drivers sold supplies on the black market. Some abandoned broken trucks on the roadside and hitchhiked back to the beaches on other convoys. Prostitution and theft flourished in the rest areas and bivouacs. The German Luftwaffe posed a theoretical threat. Convoys of slow-moving, clearly marked trucks should have been prime targets for strafing runs. But by August 1944, German air power had been so thoroughly degraded that even these tempting targets were rarely attacked. The real enemy was exhaustion, and yet the drivers kept going. They delivered the goods. Trucks broke down, but they did not stop. The saying of the time was that red ball trucks broke but did not break. Drivers who experienced mechanical failures pushed their vehicles off the road and hitched rides on the next convoy passing by. When they reached the supply depots in Normandy, they were recycled back into the rotation and given another truck. The system was inefficient, chaotic, and brutal. It was also astonishingly effective. Between August 25th and November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express transported 412,193 tons of supplies from Normandy to the front lines. At any given time, an average of 900 vehicles were on the road. The convoy stretched from horizon to horizon. At dusk, the blackout lights created a ribbon of white and red specks that disappeared into the distance in both directions. A first lieutenant in charge of a truck platoon, cresting a hill somewhere in France in the autumn of 1944, scanned the sky instinctively for enemy aircraft. The skies were empty, but as far as he could see, ahead and behind, the descending night was pierced by the cat eyes of hundreds of trucks snaking along the highway. The frontline troops recognized what the Red Ball drivers were accomplishing. An armored division commander, whose tanks depended on the constant flow of gasoline, praised the black drivers for delivering fuel under constant fire. He said he would not want their job. A tank driver from the 5th Armored Division stated simply that without the Red Ball, his unit could not have moved. General George Patton's Third Army continued its relentless advance eastward. The Germans, who had invented blitzkrieg, were astonished by the speed and aggressiveness of the American pursuit. Patton's armor raced toward the German border. He did not stop because the Wehrmacht stopped him. He stopped only when his tanks ran out of fuel. And then the Red Ball Express delivered more fuel, and he started again. In October 1944, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower sent a message to the men of the Red Ball Express. He wrote that the tremendous task of getting vital supplies from ports and depots to combat troops, when and where such supplies were needed, was material without which armies might fail. He expressed his deep appreciation to the drivers, mechanics, and officers who kept the Red Ball vehicles constantly moving. He concluded by saying they were doing an excellent job. Coming from Eisenhower, a man who understood logistics as well as any general in history, this was high praise indeed. Eisenhower knew that no matter how well-trained or numerically superior his forces were, they would be helpless without adequate supplies of food, fuel, and ammunition. The Red Ball Express officially ceased operations on November 16, 1944. By that date, the port facilities at Antwerp, Belgium, had been captured and cleared of German damage. French railway lines had been repaired sufficiently to resume freight service. Portable gasoline pipelines had been laid across hundreds of miles of liberated territory. The emergency that had necessitated the Red Ball had passed, but the legacy of the operation continued. Several other express convoy routes were established throughout the remainder of the European campaign. The White Ball Express operated from Le Havre and Rouen to the Paris area starting in early October 1944. The Little Red Ball carried priority supplies from Normandy to Paris. The Green Diamond Express moved supplies from Normandy to railheads 100 miles inland. The Red Lion Express supplied the British the 21st Army Group in Belgium. The ABC Express route, running from Antwerp to Brussels to Charleroi, carried supplies from the Belgian port 90 miles inland. The XYZ route, the last long-haul trucking operation of the war, carried supplies across Germany in the final weeks before victory. But none of these later operations achieved the scale or the mythic status of the original Red Ball. Drivers who operated trucks on any route, even months after the Red Ball ended, believed they were part of the Red Ball. The name had become synonymous with military trucking itself. After the war, the Red Ball Express faded from public memory. In the hundreds of films about World War II, it received little mention. Histories of the European campaign focused on battles and generals, not on logistics and truck drivers. In 1952, Universal Pictures released a film titled Red Ball Express starring Jeff Chandler. The movie was highly fictionalized and did not accurately represent the racial composition or the experiences of the drivers. In the early 1970s, CBS created a television sitcom called Roll Out, loosely based on the Convoy system. It was canceled after 12 episodes. The real story deserved better. The Red Ball Express demonstrated what military planners have understood for centuries. Logistics determine what is possible on the battlefield. The most brilliant tactical commander, the most advanced weapons, the bravest soldiers, all become irrelevant if they cannot be supplied. The German Wehrmacht, despite its reputation for mechanized warfare, relied heavily on horses for transportation. Germany employed more than 2.8 million horses during World War II. The United States Army, by contrast, was the most mechanized military force in the world. That mechanization was made possible by the truck, and the truck was made possible by the men who drove it. Colonel John Sheldon Dude Eisenhower, son of the Supreme Allied Commander and himself a veteran of the European theater, wrote a generation after the war that the spectacular nature of the advance through France was due in as great a measure to the men who drove the Red Ball trucks as to those who drove the tanks. He concluded that without the Red Ball, the advance across France could not have been made. General Ewart George Plank, upon forming the Red Ball Express, had declared that it must never be said that a lack of supplies stopped Patton when the Germans could not. And it did not. Because of the devotion to duty of thousands of African American soldiers who had been denied the full benefits of American citizenship, but who were committed to doing their part to win the war. The contributions of black soldiers to the Allied victory in Europe extended far beyond the Red Ball Express. They served in combat units that fought with distinction, including the 761st Tank Battalion, the Tuskegee Airmen, and numerous infantry regiments. But the Red Ball stands as a unique achievement. It succeeded not despite the racial composition of its drivers, but in part because of the determination of men who understood that their service would not be fully recognized, that they would return home to a country that still treated them as second-class citizens, and who drove the trucks anyway. They drove through exhaustion, danger, and discrimination. They kept the supplies moving. They kept the armies advancing. They helped end the war. In the decades after 1945, the story of the Red Ball Express became a footnote in military history. But the operation itself represented something larger than logistics. It demonstrated the fundamental injustice of a system that deemed black soldiers unfit for combat while simultaneously relying on their labor, courage, and sacrifice to achieve victory. It showed that the boundaries between combat roles and service roles were artificial. Red Ball drivers fought their way through enemy pockets. They required armored escorts. They delivered supplies under fire. They encountered mines, sabotage, and enemy aircraft. The designation of their work as non-combat was a bureaucratic fiction designed to maintain segregation, not an accurate description of the dangers they faced. The Red Ball Express also revealed the consequences of strategic decisions made far from the front lines. Eisenhower's choice to bomb the French railways before D-Day was tactically sound. It achieved its objective of preventing German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. But it also created the supply crisis that necessitated the Red Ball in the first place. Wars are not won by single decisions or single battles. They are won by the accumulation of thousands of smaller choices, by the ability to adapt to unforeseen circumstances, and by the willingness of ordinary soldiers to perform extraordinary tasks under impossible conditions. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were not celebrated heroes. They were not awarded medals for valor in numbers proportionate to their contributions. Most returned to their respective units after November 16, 1944, and continued serving in obscurity. Some survived the war and came home to America, where they faced continued segregation and discrimination. Some did not survive. The casualty figures for Red Ball drivers are incomplete, but scores of men were killed or injured by enemy fire, landmines, aerial attacks, and accidents caused by fatigue and equipment failure. They were considered rear echelon troops, but they died doing their jobs. Today, the logistics systems that supply modern military operations owe a conceptual debt to the Red Ball Express. The principle of dedicated supply routes, continuous operation, and prioritized transport remains fundamental to military planning. The global shipping networks that deliver consumer goods to homes around the world operate on similar principles: priority routing, continuous movement, and just-in-time delivery. But these systems are not the direct descendants of the Red Ball. That claim overstates the influence of a temporary wartime operation that lasted 83 days. What the Red Ball represents is a moment when necessity forced innovation, when commanders took a risk on an untested system, and when thousands of undervalued soldiers proved that they were capable of far more than the institution that employed them believed possible. The photograph most frequently associated with the Red Ball Express shows Corporal Charles Howard Johnson of the 783rd Military Police Battalion, standing at an intersection near Alençon, France, on September 5, 1944. He's waving a convoy forward with exaggerated arm motions. Behind him, a sign reads Red Ball Highway. The image captures something essential about the operation. It was not glamorous. It was not celebrated. But it worked. And the men who made it work deserve to be remembered not as footnotes in the story of World War II, but as central figures in the Allied victory. They kept the trucks rolling. They kept the armies moving. They kept the promise that freedom would prevail over tyranny. And they did it without recognition, without thanks, and without complaint. That is the story of the Red Ball Express.